Good day and welcome to Blueprint for Clean Energy, a webinar speaker series hosted by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. My name is Olga Kachuk and I will be your host for today's webinar titled Green Energy Choices, an Environmental Assessment of Low-Carbon Electricity. The Blueprint for Clean Energy webinar series invites leading practitioners and researchers in the field of clean energy to talk about the latest opportunities and developments in corporate, nonprofit, and public-private arenas. In today's webinar, we will explore the life cycle issues associated with renewable energy and storage with our speaker, Edgar Hertwich. Edgar is a professor of industrial ecology at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He directed the Green Energy Choices study of the International Resource Panel. Edgar has served as a lead author of the energy chapter of the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. Prior to Yale, he was a professor of energy and process engineering at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology while conducting the bulk of this work. Before we begin, we would like to remind our listeners that we welcome any questions you might have and will direct them to our speaker towards the end of the talk. Please type questions directly into the GoToWebinar chat window throughout the presentation. And with that, we welcome Edgar Hertwich to Blueprint for Clean Energy. Edgar, thank you for joining us.
Good day. Thank you, Olga. So clean power. We hear a lot these days about photovoltaics, wind energy, a new facility for CO2 capture and storage being opened in Canada, and large hydropower dams being planned in Africa. As we move to these new energy systems, relying on renewable energies or the capture of CO2 and its storage, we need to ask ourselves what are the benefits and costs and potential risks of such technologies. And this is basically what my team at the International Resource Panel set out to do. So I would now like to show you some of those results. First, I will provide some background and motivation, indicate what work has been done previously, but I would like to spend most of my time looking at individual technologies for electricity production and their environmental benefits and costs. I will finally compare the different technologies and look at scenarios for implementing them and what that means in terms of environmental impacts and resource use for the future. So just for some background, low carbon electricity is really important. We can see here from a background paper for the negotiations of the Paris Climate Agreement that basically says staying within 2 degrees will require a profound transformation of energy systems. 3 transformations are of particular importance: energy efficiency in all sectors, zero carbon and low carbon electricity, such as wind, solar, hydro, biomass, geothermal, nuclear, carbon capture and sequestration, and finally fuel switching to electricity and advanced biofuels. So we'll look at electricity in this seminar. And electricity here was picked because it is an area that is of tremendous importance for climate change mitigation, because it represents the largest value added within the energy sector, and of course also the largest source of CO2 emissions within the energy sector today. The IPCC has investigated 1,200 different energy scenarios for the future. They basically classed these energy scenarios as to what increase in global temperatures they would result in. And we see to the right scenarios that basically keep global temperatures below 2 degrees, and to the left scenarios that also manage to stabilize global temperatures but at higher rates. And what is shown in the figure is actually the share of low carbon sources of primary energy in the energy system. And we see that in all scenarios, the share of these low carbon energy sources increases. But if we want to stay below the increase needs to happen faster. In the end, we will all have to rely on energy without CO2 emissions in order to stabilize the temperature on the planet. And there are various scenarios out there, and we have picked one particular set of scenarios that was produced by the International Energy Agency in the Energy Technology Perspectives report. And that set of scenarios basically consists of a mitigation scenario and of a baseline scenario. And what you see in the figure here is the difference between those two scenarios in terms of the technologies that contribute to emissions reductions. And it sort of shows which technologies are important. And you can see that fuel switching and electricity efficiency is the most important contribution, but most of the remaining contributions are actually connected to the issue of what kind of sources of electricity we use. So increased use of renewables, CO2 capture and storage, and nuclear power. In order to basically investigate what are the implications of such a fundamental switch in the energy system, one needs to look at these implications in a systemic manner. And that basically means looking at the whole value chain of producing these energy producing the energy and bringing it to the market. This includes the extraction of the energy or harvesting of the energy, the production of the equipment that is used for that purpose, and finally the operations of the energy facilities themselves. So we have been basically asking ourselves, well, with all these technologies that are used in the scenarios to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, what are impacts on human health and ecosystem? And so this is what we have investigated. The primary method for doing such investigations is life cycle assessment. Now, life cycle assessment is, as I indicated, the methodology that actually uses data from various stages of the production of the energy, including the extraction of the energy and the production of the equipment and so on. And so if we look at previous work that has been done, this is a figure that I helped put together from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and its 5th assessment report. And you can see here, these are life cycle assessment results for greenhouse gas emissions. Here we see that on average, a coal-fired power plant emits 1 kilogram of CO2 to produce a single kilowatt hour of electricity. There is, of course, a range to that depending on the efficiency of the power plants and the source of the coal that is being used and how far it is being transported and so on. But most of the emissions are actually the direct emissions from the power plant. There are some emissions that are connected to the infrastructure, building the power plant, building the railways, the transport, the coal, and so on. And then there are emissions that are connected to the mining process, and in this case, methane escaping from the coal mines. If we look at gas, we see lower emissions, but they are still there. And then we see CO2 emissions that are connected to bioenergy and to these low carbon energy sources. And what we see from this study here, this comparison, is actually that the low carbon energy sources indeed have much lower greenhouse gas emissions than coal and natural gas. Now this is the second part of the figure. And here we see, in addition to PV and wind, we see CO2 capture and storage. And in the case of coal, also an advanced process of more efficient coal combustion through integrated gasification combined cycle. And of course, we see that CO2 capture and storage facilities still have some CO2 because they don't capture everything, and there's CO2 connected to the supply chain and methane emissions connected to the supply chain. Whereas PV and wind and ocean technologies basically have lower greenhouse gas emissions in their life cycle. So this is sort of an example of for the findings that life cycle assessment can deliver. Life cycle assessment, however, has been used systematically to look at the issue of co-benefits and adverse side effects of the technologies. Except for this one attempt here also in the IPCC, where individual emissions of pollutants are quantified from the different power technologies. And here we can see that various different gases are emitted at slightly higher rates or at higher rates from the coal and gas technologies than from wind power or solar power or nuclear power here. So the problem with that type of assessment is that it is very hard to read those different pollutants with next to each other, and this is by far not a full list of the available pollutants. So we know a lot more about the emissions that are caused by different power systems, and that knowledge is not utilized here. So you wonder, you know, going to a low carbon power system clearly represents a tremendous change, and it will impact the landscapes around us. If you think about a 5 megawatt offshore wind turbine, this is sort of the large size of wind turbines that are being installed today. It requires 1,200 tons of steel, so that's quite a massive structure. 350,000 of such wind turbines would be required to provide 12% of the electricity by 2050, according to the IEA scenario that we have been utilizing. You look at PV power systems, like these PV panels on a rooftop. They are not as intrusive. However, their power production is small. You can see PV provides only about 1/3 of a kilowatt hour per square meter and day. And there's a lot of aluminum and glass and copper and silver that is needed to produce a PV panel. So you might wonder, is it worth all the material and all the pollution that is connected to producing the materials and assembling them to solar cells to actually produce the electricity that comes out? On the other hand, we know, of course, that coal-fired power and gas-fired power plants do cause a lot of air pollution. Just recently, there was a release of an update of the World Health Organization's burden of disease study, which pointed out that there is a significant impact from air pollution on human health. The numbers that we have looked at indicated that 3.2 million premature deaths were caused every year from particulate matter alone. Of course, only a small fraction of that is connected to power production, but we are still talking about hundreds of thousands of people that are being affected. So let's talk about the work that we have conducted in this study. Would like to first talk about what technologies we have addressed. We have addressed coal and gas with and without CO2 capture and storage. We have addressed photovoltaic power, that's solar cells, concentrated solar power using mirrors and a steam engine, hydropower, geothermal power, and wind power. And with our life cycle methodology, we look at damage to ecosystems through pathways such as ecotoxicity, eutrophication, acidification, and we look at the damage to human health, for example, through particulate matter and human toxicity, and at the resource use in terms of major minerals such as iron, copper, aluminium, and cement, and through the use of energy, water, and land. And finally, we take a life cycle perspective. We look at the extraction of raw materials, the whole fuel supply chain, the production of the power plants, their installation, transportation of fuel and equipment, the operation of power plants, their maintenance, and finally, their decommissioning. The model we developed for the purpose was named Technology Hybridized Environmental Economic Model with Integrated Scenarios by my PhD student Thomas Gibbon. This shortens nicely to Themis, and she is actually a Greek goddess. In this technology, we employ hybrid life cycle assessment input-output modeling of different electricity generation technologies. And we calculate these technologies embedded in scenarios for the years 2010, 2030, and 2050. And finally, in a continuous scenario analysis spanning this entire time span. We have conducted an impact assessment using this life cycle impact assessment methods and calculated material requirements. So Themis actually is based on individual life cycle inventories that are collected by teams of authors, and these inventories describe each of the assessed power technologies with specific characteristics of the technologies for the years 2010, 2030, and 2050. So we take into account a certain technological improvement that is in line with the IEA scenarios and the improvements in energy efficiency and utilization of the technologies that are foreseen in those scenarios. We use background databases for the life cycle assessment to assess things like the emissions that are associated with the production of steel and aluminum and the transport of equipment and so on. This is the EcoInvent database, and we also assess an improvement of these of emissions from these processes based on the needs scenarios. Finally, we utilize the XIO-based multi-regional input-output model to reflect differences in production conditions and basically describe the economic background of the entire system. The IEA scenarios are used to look at the change in the energy mix in the future and to quantify the amount of employment of each technology in the future. So let me talk about what we find in terms of changes in environmental impacts and resource use for each of the individual power technologies. Let's first look at wind power, and here we go directly to the life cycle assessment results. So this is now an endpoint assessment. Here we are basically quantifying the impacts of wind power on human health in terms of disability adjusted life years per terawatt hour of electricity. And so you can see here, if we generate power with supercritical coal, we can see that human toxicity in particulate matter would contribute significantly to the total human health impact. In comparison, if we choose any of the wind power technologies that we have investigated here, either onshore wind power or offshore wind power, where we have investigated two different foundations, we find that the impacts are significantly reduced through the use of wind power. So on a per terawatt hour or per kilowatt hour basis, the human health impacts from wind power are much larger, much smaller than the human health impacts from coal-fired power. And the same is also true for ecosystems impact. So the impacts we have investigated on ecosystems here are various types of ecotoxicity from emissions that occur along the life cycle, and also impacts on eutrophication, which turn out to be important, or through eutrophication, which turn out to be important for coal. Here, the pollution-related ecosystem impacts of wind power are even smaller in comparison to those of coal power. So from a life cycle perspective, we have very low greenhouse gas emissions. We have a reduced exposure to particulate matter and human toxicity. We have reduced ecotoxicity and eutrophication. However, what we find is that wind power plants, and this is well demonstrated in the literature, lead to fatalities of birds and bats that collide with the rotors. And so we see that this is an issue that we cannot address within the frame of our life cycle assessment methods, and that is of clear ecological concern. Now, we've tried to investigate further how important those fatalities are, and we have found actually that there is an active work going on reducing those fatalities, either through the operations of the power plants, where birds are detected by radars and power plants are slowed down to avoid collisions, or through the proper siting of wind power parks in the future. Finally, we looked at the issue of resourcing. I haven't shown any results, but it's clear that wind power has a larger consumption of bulk metals and cement than coal power. However, the increases in the material consumption are not that large, and the pollution that is associated with producing those materials has been taken into account in our life cycle assessment. Wind power also offers a lower use of water and less land use directly in terms of the land that is occupied by the wind power plant and the surrounding infrastructure. However, if you look at an entire wind park, it actually has slightly higher land use than coal-fired power, because of the land that is sort of in between the different wind power plants. So in order to build wind power plants that have a limited impact on the environment, we should find sites with good wind conditions. We should try to avoid bird and bat collision fatalities, which can be done, or reduce them at least. And we should look at recycling materials, because a significant fraction of the remaining environmental impacts of wind power is actually associated with the production of those materials. Okay, here we have another technology that is quite popular, photovoltaics. We sort of see a very similar pattern here. We see that the various photovoltaic technologies have a much lower human health and ecosystem impact than a modern supercritical coal power plant. It is the same impact categories that we've seen before. It is human toxicity and particulate matter that contribute to the human health impacts of photovoltaics, and it is various ecotoxicity impacts that contribute to the ecosystem impacts of photovoltaics here. We see slightly higher impacts for the conventional silicon based solar cells, This is related to their high energy requirement during production, and due to the fact that we model their production in China, which has a slightly dirtier electricity mix than the production in Europe or the US for the other types of solar cells. The other types of solar cells are basically thin film solar cells, and they have been gaining they have had some gain in market share, but it's still the silicon solar cells that are dominant in the market. We see very little difference in terms of environmental impacts between ground-mounted and roof-mounted solar cells. It's basically because the solar cells are the same, and the mounting doesn't have so much to say for the pollution impacts here. The only difference that we don't show here is actually a difference in land use. In the IEA scenario, about half of the solar energy that would be produced by 2050 would be produced from roof-mounted systems. This means, this implies, in other words, that the total land use requirements of photovoltaics are actually quite limited. So photovoltaics offers low greenhouse gas emissions, low particulate matter emissions, low human toxicity, except in cases where there's not a proper waste treatment of the disposed PV panels. It offers low eutrophication and ecotoxicity impacts. However, it has a high metal use, and there is some direct land use for ground-based systems. So low-impact projects would use clean energy for the manufacturing of the solar cells. They would ensure recycling of the materials, and in general, roof-mounted systems have a slight advantage over ground-mounted systems because of their land use. Another technology for producing solar energy is concentrating solar power. It is maybe not as well known, but it is employed at large scale in Southern Europe and the southwest of the United States. In this technology, mirrors actually focus direct sunlight onto some collector, which produces steam, and the steam is converted to electricity. This technology has the advantage actually that the heat can be stored and electricity can be produced in the evening when there might be additional demand. The technology offers low greenhouse gas emissions, low particulate matter exposure, low human toxicity. There are some concerns that are associated with the fluids that are used to transfer and store the heat, and these need to be properly managed. And if this is done, there's low ecotoxicity and eutrophication. There is resource use associated with this technology, and that is actually a problem here, and that is the water use. As this technology employs direct sunlight, it works best in areas that have low humidity. However, areas that have a low humidity also generally have little water available. And the water here is used to cool the steam engine. There's a high land use. It is somewhat higher than in the case of photovoltaics in the plants that we have analyzed. And for the power tower, the facility we see here in the picture, there's a high cement use. I could imagine, however, that that's an issue that can be addressed through improved design in the future. Low impact projects use heat storage to produce electricity in the evening and the night, and thereby can avoid backup power. And the siting would be such as to avoid sensitive habitat. A good management of the heat transfer cycle, that means the heat transfer fluids, is required in order to avoid toxic impacts from those. Hydropower is maybe the most well-established form of renewable power, and it has significant advantages. It offers low greenhouse gas emissions. However, there are some hydropower dams that have high biogenic methane emissions, and these can be a problem. In terms of human health impacts, a life cycle assessment indicates low air pollution impacts, but there are some issues that are connected to the construction of sites in certain areas. There can be significant ecosystem impacts as riparian habitats change, and this is well documented. In general, hydropower has high water use because of evaporation, the average hydropower plant has high land use for the reservoirs and uses quite a lot of cement for building the dam. Low impact hydropower projects address issues of providing enough water for the fish that lives in the stream at all times, and there are various mitigating measures that have been developed for various types of hydropower projects. Hydropower dams with low greenhouse gas emissions per unit electricity produced are dams that have a high power density. That means they produce a lot of electricity per unit area. For geothermal power, this is a power technology that is used in quite a lot of countries, but delivers only limited amounts of electricity at this point. Geothermal power plants have low greenhouse gas emissions, low particulate matter emissions, low human toxicity, and there can be some issues that are associated with the use of geofluids or the release of geofluids, gases and fluids that basically come up when heat is transported from deep ground. So direct emissions can be very site-specific and depend on the technology that is being employed. Now, back to a major technology here. I want to talk about CO2 capture and storage. CO2 capture and storage is basically a technology in which the CO2 from a fossil power plant is captured through one of various processes, cleaned, compressed, and stored underground in a geological formation. And here we have analyzed different technologies, both pre-combustion and post-combustion technologies for the case of coal-fired power. And what we see in all the cases actually is that environmental impacts increase with the utilization of CO2 capture and power. And these are, of course, environmental impacts without taking into account the impacts of greenhouse gases. And the increases are on the order of about 1/3 compared to the power plants, the same power plants without CO2 capture and storage. So here we have the only case where we have quite a clear trade-off, where actually greenhouse gas mitigation causes an increase in other pollution impacts per unit of electricity produced. And the significant cause for this increase is actually the energy that is required during the capture process. So engineers here talk about the energy penalty of the process of capturing CO2. So these systems have low greenhouse gas emissions. They can cause substantial fugitive methane emissions, and that depends on the fuel source. And there's a concern about CO2 leakage. We have looked at that, and we think that yes, this is a concern, but maybe it's not quite as serious. For human health, there are solvent-related emissions that people are concerned about, and we think that their human health impact is not as high as the impact of emissions during the fuel chain. There are emissions of particulate matter, and they are higher than for conventional power plants, and there is human toxicity, an increase in human toxicity. And there's also an increase in eutrophication connected to mining, and there is an increase in ecotoxicity. More fossil resources are used, and we also need to recognize that CO2 storage space underground itself is a limited resource. However, these technologies are widely employed in climate change mitigation scenarios because they are able to provide power in situations where other technologies struggle to do so. So low impact projects reduce emissions in fuel production and transport by sourcing fuels from the proper technologies and by employing various technical and operational measures to do so. And that's, I think, the main remaining source of potential emission reductions. In addition, of course, we need to look at further improving the technologies in order to reduce emissions and improve the efficiency of the capture process and the power conversion itself. So now, yes, now I've gone through all the individual technologies, and Olga asked me to actually open up for some questions.
Yes, thank you. So we've had a few questions around the methodology. So just a quick clarification. Victor asked, were visual and noise impacts evaluated for wind power?
Noise impacts and visual impacts, no, we have not evaluated those.
Okay, great. And can you clarify the report's methodology for selecting the energy types for consideration? There were a few questions around nuclear being included in the IPCC reports and then excluded in your report.
Yes, I mean, some of that has to do just with questions of the ability to conduct an assessment. So assessing the environmental impacts of nuclear power requires knowledge of a whole different set of impacts, and basically an assessment of the risk of accidents, which we haven't done very systematically here. So so we have excluded nuclear power for that reason, and the other technology that was excluded was bioenergy, and that was basically done because it is a very controversial technology that also depends very much on the details of its implementation.
Great, thank you. So for those of you just joining us, we're speaking with Edgar Hertwich on the life cycle issues of various renewable energies. So far, we've covered life cycle assessment modeling for the various forms of electricity generation. And in the next 10 minutes, Edgar will provide us with a comparison of the technologies and policy implications. And then we'll pose more questions to Edgar for our Q&A session. So Edgar, thank you.
Yes, thank you. So these are basically now all the results of the different technologies next to each other. And what we can see in the middle here with the coal technologies and the gas technologies with and without CCS, and we see these patterns that they're quite high. And then to the left we have photovoltaics and concentrating solar power. And these emissions, these technologies offer low human health impacts, a little bit higher for the silicon-based solar cells. And to the right, we have two power plants reservoir hydropower plants, and then various wind power technologies and the geothermal plant. And we can see that in general that the renewable technologies have lower impacts, and the technologies with CO2 capture and storage have higher impacts. So a similar pattern arises also for pollution impacts on ecosystems. Again, there are quite low impacts connected to wind and some of the hydro plants, and there are low impacts connected to a lot of the solar technologies, but there's an increased impact connected to CO2 capture and storage. Now, those results I haven't shown you yet. They relate to the land occupation that is associated with different power plants. And we can see, and I was surprised about that actually, that renewable powers in general doesn't have higher land use than coal-fired power, with the exception of some of the reservoir hydropower plants, and this is still a very efficient one. So there are some hydropower plants that require even larger dams per unit of electricity generated. The wind power plants here, as I said, this is the land use only for the installations themselves and the access roads and transformers and all of that. But if you include the land that constitutes a wind park in between the wind power plants, we would be somewhere up here where we have this hydropower plant. In general, land use plays a role, as land is a limited resource, and we're competing with the habitat of wild animals, and we're competing with food production potentially, and so this is definitely an issue that we should pay attention to. But there is just not a very clear finding here in terms of what power technology is preferred compared to another technology, maybe with the exception of the low land use, of course, as expected, of the roof-based PV systems, and actually the low land use associated with natural gas-fired power. And now that I've talked about the metals being used in the cement, and here you can see actually a reverse picture that natural gas and coal has fairly low use of minerals, whereas these renewable technologies have a higher use of those minerals and metals. And so this is something to pay attention to. Finally, I want to look at scenario results. And here I just show you a few of the indicators. So here we're comparing the baseline scenario that basically consists of a continuation of present energy policy with a doubling or more than doubling of electricity production. And contrast that to the blue map scenario, which consists of a radical change of the electricity generation system to a largely renewable and CCS-based system. And what we can see, as expected and hoped for, is of course a dramatic reduction of greenhouse gas emissions with the blue map scenario compared to a continued increase with the baseline scenario. For other indicators, we see actually a similar pattern. For eutrophication, we see a continued increase of emissions of eutrophying substances with the baseline scenario. Those are substances that contribute to algal blooms and water pollution, and a reduction of those substances with the blue map scenario. And for particulate matter, we see that emissions of particulate matter precursors are stabilized under the blue map scenario, but continue to increase and double on the baseline scenario. And finally, I'm coming to the materials here. So here we're looking at those four major materials that power systems are made out of. And we can see that throughout the time period of the scenario, we will require more materials to implement a climate mitigation scenario. Then we would need to continue on the business as usual path. However, the difference is dramatic, and most of these materials are actually needed to put low carbon power infrastructure. They're not used up in the process, and they can be recycled into new power plants if there's a need for that, at least with the exception of cement. So then the metals we will be able to recycle, and then basically once we have built up the stock of materials in the power system, we can use them almost in perpetuity, and that is an attractive feature. So just to summarize, from a life cycle perspectives, the greenhouse gas emissions of electricity produced from renewable sources are less than 6% of those generated by coal and less than 10% of those generated by gas power. Solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal power, if it is used instead of fossil fuel power, reduces greenhouse gas emissions and other pollution impacts on human health and ecosystems. Impacts are reduced by a factor of 3 to 10. Then about land use, natural gas combined cycle plants, wind power and roof-mounted solar power systems have low land use requirements, while coal-fired power plants and ground-mounted solar power require large areas of land, and so does hydropower, or most hydropower plants. There are site-specific environmental impacts, such as the ecological impacts of coal mines and hydropower dams and wind turbine installations, that vary quite greatly depending on the significance of the species and habitats that are affected by the power plants. These issues have not been addressed in detail in our scenario modeling because we didn't model the sites at which future power plants would be installed. However, we read in the literature that these impacts could be mitigated or offset to a significant degree by proper site selection, planning, and a careful implementation of the projects. Finally, CO2 capture and storage, which is seen as necessary by most of the energy scenarios, can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 75%, however, at the expense of increasing other types of pollution between 5 and 80%. So with this, I would like to close my presentation. The summary report is available at that website, and the more detailed report will be released in a few weeks once we're done with the typesetting. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Edgar. So we have quite a few questions from our online audience. The first one is Lisa asking about the impact on human health for both PV panels and wind turbines, and whether you considered the consequences during the mining phase for each element.
Yes, absolutely. So this is taken into account in our life cycle methodology, and here you see that we have quantified the amounts of materials that are needed. We are showing you here aluminum, copper, and iron, and cement. But of course, we also take into account the silicon and the silver and the gold and the indium and tellurium that is needed to fabricate those different PV panels and to mount the material and so on. And so this is comprehensively included in our assessment.
Great. And we've had two questions about fuel cells. Were fuel cells considered for natural gas-based power, and how would you assess their environmental impacts?
Well, we have not really assessed them at the level that we have assessed these other technologies here. There's a short section on fuel cells in the report that basically describes the technology. The main advantage of fuel cell is that it offers a higher conversion efficiency compared to a gas turbine or something like that. And there are issues connected to the specific catalysts in particular that are employed in fuel cells, and we have not assessed those issues.
Great, thank you. Do you have any thoughts regarding the cost of geothermal itself?
No, I'm not aware exactly what the issues are that impact the costs of different geothermal projects. I
Okay.
think they vary. I think they depend to a significant degree on the local resource situation.
Mm-hmm. What insights does the report give us into what might be an optimal global energy mix that would balance our projected energy needs and would also tie in the SDG commitments that many countries have made?
Yeah, I think we should utilize those renewables that where they are available and can be implemented without too much trouble. I think our report quite clearly shows that that they are a clean source of electricity.
Great, thank you. We've had a few questions around the scenarios and how they were modeled. Specifically, what geographic areas were modeled in the scenarios, and how do these findings apply to developing countries?
Mm. Well, the scenarios in principle were modeled sort of with global coverage. From the IEA, we got data on the 9 world regions that they have assessed in their scenario model, and so we basically built our model to reflect the specific production technologies in those 9 world regions, and then we forwarded the scenario for each of the regions so that the production of the individual power plants would reflect the technologies that were available in this, in particular the electricity mixes that were used in each of the 9 world regions. So in principle, we don't see, I mean, we see some regional variations. Of course, there are some regions that use a lot more coal power and other regions that use a lot more renewable electricity today or nuclear power. And of course, those regions that have cleaner power today also produce new power systems with less emissions than those regions that use a lot of coal power, for example. So that are effects that we model and take into account. But I don't think that the overall conclusions or findings are affected by those regional issues to a significant degree. I think the main regional effects are actually connected to the availability of the resources locally, and those vary much more on the finer grain scale than the one we have resolved with our 9 world region model. So for specific planning of capacity additions in existing electricity systems, you would probably want to conduct a similar exercise, but using a much finer grid and a much finer assessment of what power plants would be built and where they would be built and so on.
Mm-hmm, got it. Do you know of any economic impact research for the various technologies that looked at the direct, indirect, or induced jobs that were created as a result?
We have looked at some of those studies as part of the IPCC assessment. Those studies with regard to job generation are by no means as detailed and systematic as the work I have presented here for environmental impacts. But in general, the finding is that that there is more local job generation connected to renewable energy. But it can depend on the situation, and of course there are people employed in coal mines and so on as well, so we must not forget those.
Great. And for marine energy, did you consider including that in the report?
Yeah, the problem with marine energy is really that the technologies are quite immature, and so I mean we could have assessed any of the technologies that are described in the literature, but we really don't know whether any of these technologies will be employed on a large scale, and that situation is significantly different from any of the more mature technologies that we have investigated.
Got it.
But I think it would be really great to have marine power. I really hope people are working on it because there's the issue of intermittency with solar power and wind power. So the dependence of the power generation on the fact that the sun shines or the wind blows. And of course, the more energy sources we can bring online that are out of sync with each other, the better. And so, you know, a tidal power plant or a wave power plant could maybe generate electricity when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow, and so it would be very welcome in the energy mix.
Can you elaborate on the other types of pollution that can come from CCS?
Yeah, what we see is the main sources of pollution are actually just more of the same pollution that is associated with coal-fired or gas-fired power plants. So it is pollution that is associated with the mining of the coal, with the transport and storage, and of course the air pollution that comes out of a coal-fired power plant. I should say, however, that the coal-fired power plants that we have modeled here, they all use very modern pollution cleaning equipment, and so there are plants out there in reality that have much higher impacts than what I've shown on these slides.
And as you mentioned, the site-specific environmental impacts of hydropower and wind turbines vary greatly based on location. So short of conducting life cycle assessments on all possible locations, how can we start to use your results and mitigate these impacts?
Well, I mean, the thing in the report, if you actually read the chapter when it comes out, we try to carefully point to factors that contribute to high impacts. And so it's issues such as a low power density that play a role for the emissions of methane and biogenic CO2. And then it's questions of, you know, putting in place a system of, you know, keeping a minimum water flow, what they call environmental flow management, and various other mitigating systems that really depend on the local situation and the project at hand that can be utilized to reduce the impacts. And frankly, there are some power plants in the world that should have never been built for all sorts of reasons that are really bad examples of hydropower. But those are a minority of the power plants. So it's a small number of plants that sort of give the technology some bad reputation.
Great. Well, that concludes the talk on green energy choices, an environmental assessment of low carbon electricity. Edgar, thank you for joining us today. To view a recording of this webinar, please visit the Events tab on the Yale Center for Business and the Environment website, or access the recording through the Yale iTunes University podcast. Be sure to register for our next webinar on April 7th for a discussion on accelerating energy storage deployment with Paul Gardner of DNVGL and Mike Hopkins of ICE Energy. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, this is Olga Kachuk from the Yale Center for Business and the Environment.